I was thrilled to finally move into the house my grandparents had left me, imagining the warmth of old memories waiting inside and the life I was about to build there. But as I pulled into the driveway, my excitement shattered. An unfamiliar car sat parked outside, the porch had been redecorated, and the garden was filled with flowers that weren't my grandmother's. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Karen, the overbearing head of the HOA, had taken my home and moved her daughter and her fiancé in, turning what should have been my fresh start into a nightmare. Hey, just before we jump into the crazy details, do us a quick favor. Drop a comment below letting us know which city you're watching from. It might sound small, but it really boosts our channel and helps more people discover these stories. And while you're at it, smash that like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all the insane HOA, Karen, and neighborhood saga videos we've got coming. My grandparents, Evelyn and Frank, had owned this house for nearly 40 years. They were the kind of people who built a life from scratch, a modest yet cozy home filled with family traditions and stories that echoed in every room. When they passed away years ago, first Grandma Evelyn and then Grandpa Frank not long after, I was still in high school. My parents handled the will and inheritance, and though the house was left to me, we didn't have the heart to return to it. It became something of a relic, waiting for a future version of me to find purpose within its walls. That future arrived faster than expected. After finishing college, I was ready to face adulthood head-on. With student loans looming and a job search ahead, living in the house seemed like the perfect plan, practical and sentimental. I pictured myself settling in, restoring its charm, maybe even starting a garden like Grandma's. I had a vision of coming home to a place that, though aged, still held its magic. I imagined the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen where Grandma used to bake her famous apple pies. The den, where Grandpa would sit by the fireplace reading the local paper, would become my cozy spot to unwind after long days. I expected the house to be a little run down, but full of potential. I was prepared to clean out the dust, maybe deal with a few creaky floorboards and a leaky faucet or two. What I wasn't prepared for was what I actually found. The driveway had an unfamiliar car parked in it. And the front porch, instead of the rocking chair my grandparents loved, had new furniture that looked like it had been purchased recently. My stomach twisted as I approached the door. The lock was new. Confused, I knocked. There was no answer, but I could hear faint voices inside. I knocked harder, and eventually the door creaked open. Just a crack. A young woman stood there, early 20s, with messy hair and a bewildered look. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of moving boxes, furniture I didn't recognize, and decorations that weren't my family's. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone defensive. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Who am I? I'm the rightful owner of this house, the place where my childhood memories live, the house I inherited legally. But before I could answer, another voice chimed in from the hallway. "Who is it, babe?" A man, presumably her boyfriend, joined her at the door. I stammered for a moment before finding my voice. "This is my house. I'm Tom, Evelyn, and Frank's grandson. I just finished college and was planning to move in." The woman exchanged a glance with her boyfriend, her expression hardening. "I think you're mistaken," she said, stepping further into the doorway. "We've been living here for months. Karen from the HOA approved everything." Karen. The name set off a series of red flags. Karen was the head of the Homeowners Association, a woman notorious for enforcing arbitrary rules and meddling in the neighborhood's affairs. Growing up, I remembered my grandparents dealing with her frequent complaints. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. Somehow, Karen had managed to take control of the house while it sat empty, and now her daughter and her fiancé were living here, claiming it as their own. I didn't expect this. I expected a house waiting to be brought back to life, not stolen out from under me. As I stood there on the porch, The weight of what I was about to uncover began to sink in. The home I thought was mine was tangled in Karen's web, and I wasn't sure just how deep her grip went. But one thing was certain. I wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. Determined not to let this go without answers, I left the porch and marched across the neighborhood to Karen's house. It wasn't hard to find. It was the biggest, most polished property on the block, with its pristine garden and perfectly aligned hedges. Her house was a sharp contrast to the worn-out charm of mine. It reeked of someone who loved control, and right now I hated that she had any over my life. I knocked firmly on the door, heart pounding with a mixture of anger and confusion. After a few moments, the door swung open, revealing Karen. She was exactly how I remembered her, mid-50s, sharply dressed, with a smile that felt more like a mask than an expression of kindness. "Well, well," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Tom, isn't it? Evelyn and Frank's grandson." She didn't seem surprised to see me. That only made my blood boil more. "We need to talk," I said, stepping past her invitation and into her immaculately decorated foyer. I wasn't here to play polite. Karen closed the door behind me with an air of calm superiority, as if she had already rehearsed this encounter. She led me to the living room, where we sat across from each other, her gaze sharp but patient, like a cat watching a mouse. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Why are strangers living in my house? Why do they think it belongs to them?" Karen didn't flinch. "I knew you'd come around eventually," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You see, Tom, the house had been sitting empty for years. The HOA has rules about abandoned properties. We can't have homes falling into disrepair and lowering property values." "It wasn't abandoned," I snapped. "It was my inheritance. I had every intention of moving in once I finished college." "Well," she said with an almost patronizing sigh, "the HOA viewed it differently. When no one maintained the property, we classified it as abandoned under neighborhood guidelines. The HOA has the authority to take possession and lease or sell homes under those conditions." My stomach churned. "You can't just take someone's inheritance. That's illegal." Karen shrugged, as if my objection was irrelevant. "We followed all the proper channels, Tom. Public notices were issued, attempts were made to contact the property's next of kin." "No one contacted me," I interrupted, fists clenching. "I never received any notice." "I can't control what gets lost in the mail," she replied, her voice saccharine sweet. "But that's neither here nor there. The property is occupied now. My daughter and her fiancé are paying rent and maintaining the home, which benefits the entire neighborhood." I could feel the heat rising in my face. "You mean you let your daughter move into my house?" She leaned forward, her tone softening as if she was doing me a favor. "Look, Tom, this can be resolved peacefully. I'm sure we can come to an agreement. My daughter and her fiancé are happy there, and they've done a lot to improve the place. Why not let them stay? You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You don't need to be tied down to a house." I sat there, staring at her, stunned by how easily she dismissed my connection to the home and my family's history. The audacity, the entitlement, it was suffocating. I stood up abruptly. "I'm not letting this go, Karen. That house belongs to me, and I'm going to prove it." She smiled faintly, almost amused. "You're welcome to try, Tom, but you should know legal battles can be expensive. Are you sure you want to go down that road?" Her warning was clear, but so was my resolve. I left her house feeling angrier than ever, but also more determined. I didn't know what obstacles I'd face, but I knew one thing for sure. Karen wasn't going to get away with stealing my home, not if I had anything to say about it. The cool evening air stung my face as I walked back to my car, Karen's smug smile still fresh in my mind. Her warning was meant to intimidate me, but all it had done was ignite a fire I hadn't felt in a long time. My grandparents didn't work their whole lives to build a home just for it to be stolen under my nose. I wasn't going to let this happen. I needed answers. If Karen had manipulated the system, I would find out how. The next morning, I headed to the county property records office. The smell of aging paper and the hum of old computers filled the room as a middle-aged clerk shuffled through files at her desk. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information on 612 Maple Avenue," I said. "Ownership transfer records, any legal notices, everything." After typing into her computer and printing out a stack of documents, she handed them over. "Here's what we have on file." I took a seat in the corner and flipped through the records. The transfer of ownership had been filed just 6 months ago under the HOA's abandonment clause. My heart sank as I read the details. According to the documents, notices had been sent to me repeatedly over the past year, and when no response was received, Karen had initiated the transfer through a property management company. But something didn't add up. I scanned the notice of abandonment. The signature line where I or my legal representative should have signed off on the notice was blank. My pulse quickened. Without that signature, the transfer was technically invalid, or at least suspicious enough to challenge. I dialed my parents. My mom picked up after a few rings. "Tom, is everything okay?" "Mom, did you ever get any notices from the HOA about the house, about them trying to declare it abandoned?" "No," she said, her voice confused. "Why should we have?" I took a deep breath. "They're saying they sent notices for months, but none of us received them." "Not a single one," she replied firmly. "If we had, you know we would have told you." I clenched my jaw. Karen's scheme was becoming clearer. Someone had deliberately ensured those notices never reached me. But who? And how? Determined to find more evidence, I spent the next few days talking to neighbors who had lived on the street as long as my grandparents had. Most of them hadn't noticed anything unusual, except for Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next door. "Someone was at the house a few months ago," she told me over tea in her cozy living room. "A man with a van. Looked like a locksmith. I saw him change the locks, and Karen was there supervising." "Karen changed the locks?" I asked, my pulse racing. "Yes, dear. I assumed she was just securing the house. I didn't think much of it at the time." I jotted down the detail. I needed to find out who that locksmith was and who had hired him. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't done. There was also a younger man, maybe in his 30s, coming in and out a few times. I didn't recognize him, but he had the keys. "Did he work for someone?" I asked, leaning forward. She thought for a moment. "He mentioned working for some property company. Can't remember the name, though." That was my next clue. I thanked her and left, determined to find out which property management company had been involved. After hours of searching online, I found what I was looking for, a small property management company affiliated with Karen's cousin. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a coincidence. She hadn't just stumbled upon my abandoned house. She had orchestrated the takeover using family connections and manipulated the system to her advantage. The more I dug, the worse it got. Karen's cousin had filed multiple cases of abandonment for other homes in the neighborhood, all of which were handed over to the HOA for resale or rental. Some families had fought back, but most couldn't afford the legal fees and gave up. I couldn't stop thinking about Karen's smug warning. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "Yes," I thought. "Absolutely." Just as I was preparing to confront Karen legally, I received an unexpected call from her daughter, Emily. "Tom, can we talk?" she asked nervously. We met at a small diner on the edge of town. She sat across from me, nervously twisting the napkin in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how bad it was until recently. My mom told me the house was legally transferred and that you weren't interested in it. But after you showed up, I started asking questions. She lied to me too." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "She said you had agreed to let us live there, But now I see that's not true. Emily pulled out her phone and opened an email thread between Karen and the property management company. I scanned the emails and my blood boiled. The emails revealed that Karen had deliberately withheld notices from being delivered to me and fast-tracked the abandonment process through her cousin's company. Emily had forwarded all of it to me. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "Because I don't want to be part of this," she said, her eyes glistening with guilt. "I didn't know she was stealing it from you." Armed with the emails and evidence, I met with a lawyer who filed an injunction to halt the current lease and stop Karen's daughter from living in the house. But I wasn't done. I wanted everyone to know what she had done. At the next HOA meeting, I stood in front of the board, neighbors watching with interest as I presented everything: the missing signature, the emails, the property management scheme. Karen sat in the corner, her face pale but composed. When I finished, the room erupted in murmurs. "I trusted you," Mrs. Patterson shouted. "How many others have you done this to?" The following week, Emily and her fiancé vacated the house, leaving behind a note apologizing for their part in the ordeal. I stepped inside. The house smelled new, but the creaking of the floorboards was still the same. The day after reclaiming my house, I sat in my lawyer's office, the weight of everything that had happened still heavy on my shoulders. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to Karen's schemes. I was taking action. "We have enough to file charges," my lawyer, Mr. Evans, said, tapping the printed emails on his desk. "Fraud, property misrepresentation, forgery. She's crossed every legal line imaginable." "I want to press charges," I said firmly. "I'm not letting her walk away." Evans nodded. "It's not just you, Tom. With the evidence we have and the other neighbors starting to come forward, Karen's looking at a civil lawsuit and possibly criminal charges. We'll let the DA handle the criminal side, but we're going after her in court for damages." I left his office that day with a plan in motion and a sense of justice brewing inside me. The next few weeks were intense. My lawyer filed a civil lawsuit against Karen, accusing her of fraudulent misrepresentation and theft of property. The key piece of evidence was the email thread from Karen's daughter, Emily, which proved she had deliberately withheld notices and manipulated the HOA's rules to take over the house. During the lawsuit, Emily testified on my behalf. I watched her on the witness stand, her voice shaking but resolute. "I believed my mom when she said the house was legally ours," Emily said. "But after Tom showed up, I started asking questions. That's when I found out my mom had hidden the notices and fast-tracked the process. I had no idea what she was doing." Karen sat stone-faced across the courtroom, but I could see her fingers twitching, her carefully built defense crumbling piece by piece. After the hearing, I ran into Karen outside the courthouse. She was standing by the steps, her gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment, I thought she would ignore me, but she looked up. "You've ruined me," she said bitterly. "No," I replied. "You ruined yourself. You could have just left my family's house alone, Karen, but you had to push your luck." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You won't stop, will you?" "No," I said, "not until every bit of damage you've done is undone." Her expression hardened. "Don't think you've seen the last of me." I walked away, her warning ringing in my ears. But it didn't scare me anymore. This time I knew I could handle whatever she tried next. The civil trial ended in my favor. The court ruled that the property transfer was fraudulent and invalidated Karen's lease with her daughter. I was officially reinstated as the legal owner of the house, but that wasn't the only victory. Karen was ordered to pay damages for the time I was prevented from living in my home, along with covering all legal fees. My lawyer told me it was a significant amount, enough to help restore the house to its former charm. But the legal battle wasn't over yet. The district attorney opened a criminal investigation, and with the overwhelming evidence we provided, Karen was arrested on charges of real estate fraud and forgery. The DA also went after her cousin's property management company, uncovering more cases of fraud in other neighborhoods. I felt a strange sense of closure seeing it all unfold. The same woman who thought she could manipulate the system and get away with it was now facing jail time and financial ruin. The house felt different when I returned. Standing in the living room, I imagined my grandparents smiling, proud of the fight I had put up to protect their legacy. The floors creaked the same way they always had, but now it was a comforting sound, a reminder that this house was mine and no one could take it away again. As I repainted the walls and patched up old cracks, I thought about everything Karen had said. Don't think you've seen the last of me. Maybe I hadn't. But for now, I had what I came for: justice, closure, and a future to build in the house that was always meant to be mine.